Hey guys, tonight we arrive in a forested Montana valley, where Linda Crawford's fresh start leads straight into a foggy nightmare no one could ever explain. You're standing at the edge of Aspen Ridge, a hush falling over the trees like a breath held too long. It's not quite dusk yet, but the sky already wears that muted, silvery blue that makes pine needles look sharper and shadows fall harder. The air smells like cold bark and wood smoke, and if you listen closely, you can almost hear the river not rushing, just murmuring to itself. This place was supposed to be peace, not luxury, not ease, not even comfort, just peace. You squint through the branches and see it. Cabin 12, a structure that should be unremarkable, even forgettable, built in the 40s by someone's grandpa, nailed together with more hope than skill. But it stood, at least for a while. In 1981, this is where Linda Crawford came to start over. Fresh divorce papers, 5 kids, barely any money. But the mountains offered something her old life never did. Distance from her ex-husband, from the bruises, from the neighbors who stared and didn't help. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere unusual, post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're all drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move closer to the cabin, feeling the gravel crunch under your boots. Linda's oldest, Emily, helped with unpacking, trying to stay busy, pretending she wasn't scared. Jason, the second oldest, already had a hammer in hand, patching the roof with duct tape and raw optimism. Megan, 12, was quiet. Too quiet. Maybe. And the 3 little boys, they bounced between the trees like puppies, their laughter somehow making the place feel less haunted. Linda did what she could with what she had. Federal assistance helped keep the kids fed, and her brother lived just 10 minutes down the road, always willing to fix a generator or bring over day-old bread. Still, Cabin 12 was barely warm in winter and barely cool in summer. A cranky wood stove, mismatched curtains, furniture salvaged from garage sales and church basements. But there was rhythm in their life, chopping firewood, fixing school lunches, putting coins in a jar for pizza night. It wasn't pretty, but it was forward. You might be surprised to know that in the early 1980s, nearly 20% of U.S. children were living below the poverty line, and in rural Montana, single mothers like Linda often lived without phones, reliable transportation, or even indoor plumbing. It wasn't exactly Little House on the Prairie, unless you imagine Laura Ingalls Wilder trying to register for food stamps. Now, their nearest neighbors were a study in contrast. Frank Peterson, a military vet with a face like hardtack, and a temper to match. He lived in Cabin 10 with Roy Caldwell, a man who seemed to dissolve into whatever corner he stood in. No job, no car, no history anyone could pin down. They were the kind of neighbors who never borrowed sugar and never smiled too long. You know the type. And yet, Frank's son, Jeremy, was a different story. He had this soft, round face that made him look younger than he was, and a habit of showing up at Linda's door holding a broken toy, asking if Jason could fix it. The younger boys liked Jeremy. He shared his licorice and was surprisingly good at fort building. Sometimes, he even slept over. You'd think this community, so far from anywhere, would pull tighter together. But Aspen Ridge wasn't Mayberry. It was the kind of place where people nodded but rarely waved, where everyone knew each other's dog's name, but no one knew each other's middle names. Historians still argue whether remote American communities in the late 20th century fostered true self-reliance or just slow-burn isolation. Aspen Ridge might have been a little of both. Still, Linda did what moms do. She made the best of it. She grew carrots and potatoes, even though the soil was mostly rocks and regrets. She taught Megan how to read by flashlight when the power blinked out. She taught Jason how to change a tire, even though he was more interested in drawing comics. She made birthday cakes with pancake mix and wild huckleberries, and she kept her doors locked at night. But even then, you could feel it, the slow shift in the air, the colder mornings that came too soon, the whisper of branches tapping on windows when no wind blew. Little things. Linda mentioned once that their mailbox had been open, that she'd found muddy footprints near the woodshed too big to be from any of her boys, that a green truck had slowed in front of their drive, idled, and rolled on without a sound. And she wasn't the only one noticing things. Her brother, Rick, had passed Frank on the trail behind their houses late one night. No flashlight, no gun, just walking in silence, staring too long. When Rick waved, Frank didn't wave back. He just kept walking. Sleep starts to tug at your mind, but don't drift off just yet. The lights in cabin 12 are still on. Linda's still trying. Emily's already planning her sleepover at the neighbors. And Megan is drawing something in her diary carefully, slowly. You'll want to remember that later. The cabin stands still in the dark, the smoke curling quietly from the chimney. And out in the trees, something waits, something that doesn't care about peace, or second chances, or pancake mix birthdays. You probably won't survive this, but don't worry. You're just here to listen. You wake up to the squeak of an old screen door and the soft clatter of dishes in a too small sink. It's morning in cabin 12, and Linda's already moving like someone who's halfway through her day by 7 a.m. Coffee percolates slowly on the stove, thick, burnt, and probably older than 2 of the kids. She's humming something tuneless while slicing store-brand bread with a dull knife, trying not to think about how long it has to last until her brother brings more groceries. You sit at the round table, elbows resting on a laminated placemat with kittens and teacups. Megan's quietly braiding her hair beside you, eyes on the window like she's watching for something or someone. Jason stomps in from outside, boots muddy and untied, announcing that the woodpile is low again. He's exaggerating. There's enough for today, but Jason likes being the man of the house, even if he still sleeps with a nightlight. Frank Peterson knocks once at the front door and enters without waiting. He always does that, says mourning like it's an accusation. He's holding a coil of rope and asks if Linda's boys want to help him chop kindling later. Linda says they're busy with schoolwork, but thanks anyway. Frank shrugs and leaves. No eye contact. Just the sound of his boots retreating down the porch steps. Now you know what's odd. Frank never asks the girls to help, never even talks to them directly. And Megan, she hides behind the pantry door until he's gone. Linda's life here is all patchwork and silence. Her car doesn't always start. Her kids share socks. They walk down to the general store together when the weather's good nearly 4 miles each way. Megan collects flat rocks on the roadside and paints faces on them. Emily always carries a book in one hand, like a shield. Most nights, they gather around the single kerosene lamp and play cards, or listen to old cassette tapes from the thrift store Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Or sometimes Joan Baez, music with the soft edges, the kind you listen to when you're trying to remember what safe feels like. One evening, Roy Caldwell stops by with a loaf of bread wrapped in newspaper, says it's from a church pantry in Kalispell. Linda accepts it with a polite nod, but you can tell she doesn't like the way he watches Megan as she crosses the room. It's not overt, it's just long, too long. Historians still argue whether the decline of tight-knit neighborhoods in rural America during the late 20th century made communities safer through privacy or more vulnerable through disconnection. In places like Aspen Ridge, neighbors weren't always friends. Sometimes they were simply people you learned to tolerate, like roaches in the cupboards or creaky stairs at 2 a.m. But despite the undercurrents, life keeps marching on. Megan gets a nosebleed one morning and draws a horse in the condensation on the window while it drips. Jason builds a slingshot. The twins, Dylan and Seth, argue about whether raccoons can open zippers. They can. Raccoons are chaos with thumbs. Jeremy, Frank's son, spends more and more time at cabin 12. He brings snacks, some of them clearly taken from Frank's stash without permission. He never talks about his mom, never says much about Roy either. One time, Linda catches him crying behind the woodshed, but when she asks what's wrong, he just says, "Kyle's not nice." That's confusing, because Kyle is Jason's best friend. He lives 2 cabins down and has a mullet so aggressive, it deserves its own zip code. Still, you file that comment away. Sometimes you walk with Megan in the woods. She talks about stars and books and whether birds understand secrets. She says she wants to be a writer one day, or maybe a detective. She likes to pretend the mossy paths are secret trails, and every tree root is a clue left behind by someone trying not to be found. It's adorable and eerie. One morning, You overhear Linda on the phone with her brother using a payphone outside the diner in town. Her voice is low and tired. She says, "I think someone's been in the house when we're gone." Rick asks if anything was stolen. "No," she replies, "but Megan's diary was moved, and someone left a hair tie on the stove." Rick tells her to call the sheriff. She says she did. He said it was probably just one of the boys, but Linda doesn't believe that. That night, she wedges a broomstick under the door handle. She tells Emily to stop going over to Jeremy's so often. Emily rolls her eyes. Jason says he'll start keeping a hatchet near the front door. Linda doesn't laugh. You can feel the shift happening like a teacup slowly sliding toward the edge of a table. Nothing crashing yet, just that sound of porcelain inching toward disaster. Linda's no fool. She senses it. But what can she do? She's 5 years removed from an abusive marriage, one phone line away from her only family, and barely holding the seams of this household together. She's already a survivor. Surely she can handle whatever's creeping through the shadows now. But Cabin 12 is changing. The air inside feels heavier. Megan stops drawing. Emily starts double-checking the window locks. Jeremy begins showing up with bruises and says he fell into a bush. Jason won't say what he found behind the shed, just that it smelled like gasoline and made the cat hiss. You breathe in the scent of pine and damp earth. You look at Linda, sitting with her coffee gone cold, staring out at the trees with her fingers drumming on the table in a rhythm that doesn't match the ticking of the clock. You want to believe this is just cabin fever, just loneliness. But you know better. You're in Aspen Ridge now, and something is watching. You wake up to snow, even though it's April. The trees wear it like powdered wigs, and the trail outside the cabin creaks under the weight of frost. Spring should be here. But in Aspen Ridge, the seasons do what they want. The cold clings, and so does the unease. April 10th slides into the calendar with no warning, and with it comes a strange, twitchy kind of quiet. Emily's away for the weekend to sleep over at the neighbor's cabin, one with central heating and an actual VCR. Jason complains that he's stuck watching his younger brothers, but he stays up late with Kyle Benson anyway, drawing superheroes and eating powdered donuts straight from the box. Linda's tired. That kind of deep tired that settles in your bones. She puts Megan to bed with a kiss on the forehead and double-checks the locks before sitting at the kitchen table with a spiral notebook and a calculator. There's a half-finished letter to the Montana Human Services office folded underneath. It begins, "To whom it may concern, I have not received this month's food allotment." Outside, something shifts, not loudly, not in a Hollywood way, just shifts. The porch creaks, but no one knocks. A bird takes off suddenly from the roof and disappears into the pines. Megan stirs in her sleep. In her dream, she sees two men in the woods. They're both wearing glasses, both arguing. One of them has something shiny in his hand. One of them calls her name. Historians still argue whether dreams in high-stress environments reflect actual memory fragments, or are simply the brain's way of stitching together fear and confusion. You'd like to think Megan's dream is just that, a dream. But later, it will matter. April 11th passes in a blur. Linda's brother Rick stops by with a jug of milk and half a bag of oranges. He jokes about the weather, but notices something's off. Linda seems jumpier than usual. She says she heard footsteps outside her bedroom window the night before. Rick offers to stay the night. Linda says no, she doesn't want to make it a thing. But it's already a thing. Later that day, Jeremy visits again. He sits cross-legged on the floor, watching the little boys play with matchbox cars. Megan watches him. He looks anxious. His hands tremble. He starts to say something twice but swallows it. At dinner, Kyle stays late. His parents don't seem to mind. He's part of the Crawford household at this point. Jason teases him about liking Megan. Kyle rolls his eyes. Megan blushes and hides behind her long hair. Night falls like a dropped curtain. Cold air seeps through the door frame. Linda checks the locks again. Jason moves the hatchet beside his mattress. Megan writes in her diary, and the green truck returns. It idles at the end of the dirt road, just far enough to not be clearly seen, but close enough that its shape glows faintly under the moonlight. Megan sees it through her window. She says nothing. She stares. Her pencil hovers above the paper. Then, slowly, she closes her diary and draws the curtain. You ever notice how certain sounds stop being background noise when you're scared? The ticking of a clock becomes a metronome for dread. The hum of the fridge feels like a threat. That night, Cabin 12 breathes heavily. The younger boys fall asleep quickly. Megan tucks them in, kisses each forehead, and turns off the light. Jason and Kyle talk into the night. Nothing important. School, girls, how cold the outhouse was this morning. Then something outside rustles. Jason goes to check. Nothing. Then something taps. Not the door, the window. Jason lifts the curtain. No one's there. They hear a creak on the porch. Kyle says maybe it's an animal. Jason nods, but he moves the hatchet closer. The morning of April 12th is cold, but the birds are loud. Emily walks home after her sleepover, sleepy-eyed and craving pancakes. She sees the front door of her cabin slightly ajar. That's odd. Linda always locks it. Always. She steps inside. The air is wrong. Thick, metallic, like rust and silence had a baby. You follow her into the hallway. There's a sound you can't place. Not buzzing, not humming, just a low, oppressive stillness. Emily turns towards the living room and stops. There's blood everywhere. On the carpet, on the walls, on the back of the couch. Her mother lies crumpled beside the fireplace, her face turned just slightly toward the door, as if waiting for someone who never came. Jason is nearby. His hand is still wrapped around the hatchet. His other hand is duct taped at the wrist. He didn't get to use it. Kyle is slumped beside the table, eyes open. His face is frozen in mid-surprise. Tape, bruises, cuts. Emily screams, not the short, startled kind. The long, pulling kind. The kind that wakes neighbors 2 cabins over and makes the birds stop singing. She runs. Rick arrives before the police. He sees the door wide open, the blood stains, the impossible violence, and pulls Emily away before she walks in again. She keeps screaming Megan's name because Megan isn't there. Not in the bedrooms, not outside, not in the woods. And the little boys, still asleep in the back room, curled under blankets, untouched, unaware, even now. No one knows how they slept through it. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they just forgot. You are standing just behind Emily now. Her scream still echoes in your ears, even though it's hours later. Her shoes are muddy from the sprint through the woods, her voice raw from calling her sister's name over and over. She didn't just find a crime scene. She found the end of her childhood. You step past the blood. It is not like in the movies. It doesn't glisten. It clings. The smell hits first a coppery, sour fog that sticks to your nose hairs and makes your stomach lurch. You're not supposed to remember smells like this, but Emily always will. Jason's body is found near the hearth, his back bent at an impossible angle. The duct tape around his ankles and wrists is sloppy torn by hand, not cut with precision. Kyle Benson's body lies on the floor by the dining table. One chair is overturned. There are bruises on his neck, but the cause of death appears to be blunt force trauma to the head. A claw hammer lies nearby, half hidden beneath a ripped flannel shirt. Linda is closest to the door, one hand stretched toward it, as if trying to reach help that never came. Her injuries are different. Rageful, frenzied, the kind that make even hardened officers go quiet. The duct tape binding all 3 is the same kind you'd find in any hardware store in Montana in 1981. Cheap, silver, easily torn. The killer or killers wanted speed, not elegance. Historians still argue whether criminal profiling was genuinely useful in rural crime cases in the late 20th century, or just a stylish guessing game for bored detectives. In this case, the profilers never even got to play. The crime scene was mishandled within the hour. The first officer on scene didn't secure the perimeter. Reporters arrived before backup. Curious neighbors wandered through the yard, leaving boot prints in the patchy snow. Evidence was kicked, touched, moved. The steak knife bent into a soft U-shape was photographed and then misplaced. It reappeared 3 days later on a shelf in the evidence room. No one could say exactly how it got there. Then came the strange part. The 3 younger boys, Dylan, Seth, and Jeremy, were found unharmed, tucked in the back bedroom. Their hands still sticky from marshmallow cereal bars. No bruises, no tape, just sleep-heavy confusion in the quiet, kind of fear you can't quite name yet. Linda's brother, Rick, demanded answers. How can they not have heard anything? He asked. They were 15 feet away. One officer suggested the killer might have drugged them, but toxicology reports came back clean. The boys gave strange answers. Dylan said he dreamed of trees with eyes. Seth said nothing at all. Jeremy The boy from next door said he'd heard someone whispering his name in the night. Later, under hypnosis, he claimed to have seen two men wearing glasses. One argued with Linda. The other pulled Megan out the back door by her wrist. He said they didn't make a sound. Not even Megan. Jeremy's story changed twice more in the weeks that followed. At one point, he said the men had green jackets. Another time, he said one of them looked like Mr. Caldwell, Roy, the reclusive roommate of Frank Peterson. The police weren't sure what to believe. And frankly, they weren't handling it well. You walk through the living room again, stepping around dried patches of blood and police marker flags. The phone line had been cut. No sign of forced entry. No broken windows. No kicked-in doors. It suggested one of two things. Either the killer had a key, or they were let in. Linda wasn't the type to trust easily. After her marriage ended, she kept her circle tight. But kids are open doors. Kids invite the world in with popsicles and comic books. Jason and Kyle often played with Jeremy, and Jeremy lived with Frank and Roy. Detectives questioned Frank that same day. He looked annoyed more than anything else. Said Linda's kids were always getting into something and that maybe this was one of those domestic things gone wrong. When asked if he knew where Jeremy had been that night, he said in bed. But when they asked Roy said Jeremy had been at cabin 12 until after dinner. Then he clammed up. The boys' bedroom was a time capsule. Dinosaur pajamas, a plastic flashlight with dying batteries, one sneaker under the bed. No blood, no sign of struggle, just sleep, impossibly undisturbed. Linda's diary was missing. Megan's was not. Hers was found beneath her mattress, open to a page where she had drawn two figures in the woods, both with glasses, one holding a hammer. You don't breathe when you see it. You don't blink. Because Megan didn't just imagine them. Later that afternoon, police dogs were brought in. They sniffed the yard, the edge of the forest, the nearby trail. They picked up a scent briefly heading north, toward the old mill path, but it stopped at the stream, as if whoever carried Megan had walked into the water and vanished. That's the first time someone mentioned the green truck. A neighbor said they'd seen it parked near cabin 12 the night before. Said it looked government-issued or maybe just beat-up army surplus. No plates, no markings. No one saw who was driving. Of course, they didn't. That would have made things too easy. The entire cabin was sealed with crime scene tape by sundown. The sky above it was the color of ash. Emily stayed with her Uncle Rick, curled in bed with a blanket that still smelled like home. She wouldn't speak for nearly 2 days. And Megan, she was still missing, out there somewhere. You close your eyes and try to imagine where she might be. In the woods, in the truck, still breathing. You don't know. No one did. You return to cabin 12, this time through the back door. The one the officers barely remembered to check. It opens onto a small, sagging porch overlooking the woods, where moss grows in the cracks of the steps, and something rustles beneath the boards. This is where Jeremy claimed Megan was taken, dragged silently by two men with glasses. You look at the floorboards. They're intact. No scratches, no scuff marks. But maybe that's the strangest part. It's too clean. You step into the boys' room again. This is where Dylan, Seth, and Jeremy were found that morning, all three asleep, tucked under flannel blankets with cartoon trucks and faded dinosaurs. The window is shut, the curtain half drawn. A Batman action figure lies on its side under the bed, its cape torn. There's something eerie about this room, not because it was untouched, but because it stayed untouched. You crouch beside the bunk bed and run your fingers along the wooden frame. Still smooth, still ordinary, but you can't help imagining it. 3 small boys in this room, while less than 15 feet away, Linda, Jason, and Kyle were dying. The air should have been electric. There should have been yelling, crashing, running, but no one woke up, no one screamed. Not even Jeremy, who later claimed he saw something. You look at him now, Jeremy, 10 years old, sitting at a child-sized table in the sheriff's office. His legs swing slightly. He's holding a styrofoam cup of cocoa, untouched. The deputy across from him is trying to sound friendly. Jeremy stares past him, like he's watching something behind the wall. They came in through the back. Jeremy says, "I think, you think?" "Yeah, I saw glasses. 2 guys. One of them said Megan's name. And then, I don't know. I woke up later. The deputy frowns. So you were asleep? Jeremy shrugs. I think so, but I saw them. I think I did. The sheriff brings in a sketch artist. Jeremy describes one of the men as having a square face and army glasses. The other, he says, had a long nose and a big chin. The sketch looks more like a cartoon than a suspect, but something in it makes Linda's brother Rick clench his jaw, because the sketch resembles Roy Caldwell. You ever notice how certain people seem to disappear while standing right in front of you? That was Roy. No job, no family, no official records after 1975. He moved in with Frank a few years earlier and rarely left the cabin. He claimed he was writing a book. No one ever saw any pages. Historians still argue whether eyewitness testimony, especially from children, is reliable enough to guide major investigations, especially in trauma cases, especially when hypnosis is involved. In this case, Jeremy's story became the fulcrum, but it kept wobbling. Later, he says Roy wasn't there, that the man had a beard, then no beard, then that maybe it was just a dream. But he remembers Megan calling for her mom, and he remembers someone covering her mouth. Emily, meanwhile, refuses to speak. Her uncle Rick tries to coax her, the sheriff asks gently. A social worker shows her a photo of Megan. She only says she was drawing the night before. They check Megan's room again. The diary's pages are smudged but intact. No entries past April 11th. The last drawing is dated with a flower sticker. It shows two men. One of them holds a hammer. The other has his hand around a small figure's wrist. You can't help but notice the hammer's detail. Megan drew it with tiny X-shaped texture across the grip, just like the one found near Jason's body. One of the most chilling details, the boy's bedroom window has a clear line of sight to the back porch. If Jeremy looked out, he would have seen Megan being taken, unless he already knew, unless someone told him not to tell. That theory sits heavily with the new officer on the case, a young detective named Carter, fresh from Billings. With a clean record and no ties to Aspen Ridge, he starts a timeline, puts red strings on a corkboard like something out of a detective drama. But here's the problem. The data doesn't line up. If Megan was taken out the back and the boys were in the room, someone would have had to keep them quiet. Someone they trusted. Someone they didn't see as a threat. You walk the path behind the cabin. The stream is still running cold, fed by snowmelt. There's a faint trail of flattened grass, a snapped twig here and there, but it stops before the tree line. No tire marks, no prints, just silence. Still, Jeremy insists he saw the green truck. Later, when asked again, he says he rode in it once. Frank let me sit in it when I was little. He said I could honk the horn. The sheriff's office doesn't find any green truck registered to Frank Peterson. You want to believe the boys were just lucky, that the killer didn't know they were there, that the locked door saved them, but that doesn't explain why their room was clean. Why not even a scream reached them? Or why, when asked, Seth whispered, "They told us to stay quiet or they'd take Megan too." They, the deputy asked. Seth nodded, almost sleepy. The man with the quiet voice and the one who smelled like paint. You file that detail away and you realize something. This wasn't just a murder. This was a message to someone or from someone. And the only ones who might still know the whole truth are three little boys who learned way too early how to keep secrets. You're standing at the edge of the forest now, right where the grass bends toward the old stream bed. This is where the dogs lost the scent, where the trail that might have led to Megan simply ends. No scrap of fabric, no footprints, no broken branches, just a whisper of something gone, like a candle snuffed out mid-flicker. Megan's face is suddenly everywhere in flyers on telephone poles, stapled next to ads for firewood and lost dogs. A school photo, her smile lopsided, hair brushed with effort but not precision. Linda had combed it that morning, probably while balancing toast in one hand and a crying toddler in the other. You've seen this photo before on cold case documentaries, in grainy newspaper scans, on internet threads, where strangers try to solve what investigators couldn't. The official search begins on April 13th. Dozens of volunteers, Forest Service staff, and even a few off-duty soldiers comb through the trees. They bring in helicopters, horses, dogs. The snow is melting fast, which makes scent work harder. Prints disappear within hours. The whole forest seems to fold in on itself, swallowing clues before they can be found. You follow the search team as they cover old logging roads and hidden trails. They find a pair of footprints, bare feet, child-sized, leading away from the cabin's back trail. But only 2 prints, then nothing. It could have been Megan, or it could have been Jeremy's imagination playing tricks again. Linda is hospitalized 2 days after the murders. Not for injuries, she's physically unharmed, but grief has lodged itself somewhere behind her ribs, and she stops speaking, refuses food. For hours, she just stares at the ceiling and whispers Megan's name like a prayer or a password she hopes will unlock a door back to before. In the meantime, Jeremy is questioned again. This time, detectives try something new: hypnosis. It was surprisingly trendy in early 80s police work, used in dozens of high-profile cases despite controversial accuracy. Historians still argue whether it helped or merely created false memories. In Jeremy's case, it does both. He starts by mumblings about the cabin, the creaky porch, and the cereal his mom won't buy anymore. Then, something changes in his face like a curtain dropping. His voice shifts. "I saw her. Megan." "When?" The officer prompts. "After the hammer." There's a long pause. "She was holding my hand. Was she hurt?" Jeremy shakes his head. "She was scared. They told her to be quiet. The one with glasses said he'd come back if she screamed." "What else?" "He had tape in his pocket. And the other man, he had paint on his hands. Green." The officers freeze. Paint. It clicks for one of them, Roy Caldwell. Frank's silent, evasive roommate had once told Rick, offhandedly, that he used to work detailing trucks, mostly army surplus, mostly green. No one thought much of it at the time. But suddenly, the green truck re-enters the frame. Big, boxy, slight dent above the back left fender. Neighbors confirm they'd seen one matching that description parked behind cabin 10. On and off for months. But by April 13th, it's gone. Vanished. No trace, no registration, no plates. Emily, still silent, begins sketching again. Not words, just images. In one drawing, she shows a truck. The same truck Megan drew in her diary, the same shape Jeremy describes. It's parked under a tree, and in the passenger seat sits a small figure with her head turned away. Detectives begin to look harder at Frank and Roy. Frank is questioned again. This time, he's defensive, claims the drawings mean nothing, says he was home all night, drinking. No one can confirm. Roy says he went to bed early and doesn't get involved in family things. You hover near them, watch their body language. Roy fiddles with the collar of his shirt. Frank keeps wiping his hands on his pants like they're sticky. Both men refuse polygraph tests. Frank smirks when asked. "Waste of taxpayer money," he mutters. The sheriff's office finds no direct evidence tying them to the scene. No fingerprints, no blood, nothing that would hold up in court. But there's something else. A journal entry from Frank's son Jeremy, written a week before the murders, found in his school notebook. It says, "Mom says Roy talks in his sleep, says he killed someone once. I don't know if he's lying, but he said, hide her where they won't find her." When questioned, Jeremy claims he made it up, says it was just something from a movie, but the tone changes every time Roy enters the room. Meanwhile, Linda's brother Rick takes matters into his own hands. He visits Frank one evening with a thermos of coffee and a loaded pistol in his glove box. They talk on the porch for 10 minutes. No one knows what was said, but after that day, Frank stops walking the trails at night, stops showing up at town council meetings, starts double-locking his doors, and still no Megan. Weeks pass, then months. The case goes cold, and so does the trail. Megan's face fades from posters. The forest grows back around cabin 12 like a wound closing without healing. The boys grow up. Jeremy moves away with an aunt. Dylan and Seth are adopted by relatives in Spokane. And Linda, she stays, even after the house is empty, even after cabin 12 is declared uninhabitable. She lives nearby, in a trailer with thin walls and a tin roof that rattles when the wind blows. She never leaves Montana, because somewhere out there, her daughter is still missing. And even though no one's found Megan yet, Linda still sets a place at the table for her, just in case. You're in the sheriff's evidence room now. It's 1981. And this place smells like cigarettes, floor polish, and forgotten paperwork. The overhead lights buzz just enough to remind you that nobody ever really rests here. Not when 3 people are dead. Not when a child is missing. The murder weapons are stored in brown paper bags with handwriting that's already starting to smudge. A claw hammer, still faintly stained. A bent steak knife that looks more like a broken tool than a blade. One corner of the evidence tag curls upward like it's trying to leave the building altogether. You stare at the hammer first. It's heavy. A contractor-grade claw head with that X-pattern grip Megan somehow remembered in her drawing. Forensics found partial prints on the handle, but none matched anyone in the system. Of course, in 1981, Montana's fingerprint database wasn't exactly cutting edge if you weren't already a known criminal. The system had nothing on you, and no prints were taken from Roy Caldwell. Administrative oversight. The report later said, sure, you flip through the photos in the case file, black and white. Gruesome in their own quiet way. Jason's hands bound. Kyle's crushed skull. Linda's final posture face turned toward the hallway, hand outstretched. The kind of details you try to forget but never really can, especially not in a small town. The scene tells a story, but not a clear one. There are signs of a struggle, overturned chairs, a broken lamp, a shoe print in the kitchen, size 11, with a partial waffle tread common among military-style boots in the 70s and 80s. Frank wore size 11. So did half the town. No help there. Historians still argue whether early forensic analysis relied too heavily on circumstantial common-sense deductions like assuming only men could wield a hammer with enough force to kill. The truth is, nothing about this case makes sense. Not the silence, not the tape, not the missing girl. Let's talk about that tape. Duct tape was used on all 3 victims. Sloppily, jagged ends. No fingerprints on the adhesive, just fibers. You know what kind of fibers? Polyester. From the same kind of gloves mechanics used in rural garages at the time. Guess who had a background in auto detailing? Roy Caldwell. They checked Frank's garage. No gloves. They asked Roy where he kept his. He said he didn't own any. The detective wrote, no visible residue on hands at time of questioning. No stains under fingernails. You want to scream, but the case keeps slipping through your fingers like sand in winter wind. And then there's the diary. Not Megan's, Linda's. It was missing when the police first swept the cabin. Found 2 weeks later inside the crawl space, wrapped in a towel beneath loose floorboards. Some pages were ripped out, but the remaining entries gave just enough to open a new line of suspicion. One entry read, Frank's been weird. Keep stopping by for no reason. Jeremy seems scared of Roy now. Megan said someone's been knocking on her window at night. Can't be animals. She says it sounds like fingers. You read that again? Sounds like fingers. Another entry. I asked Megan where she got the green button. She said it was from the truck man. I don't know. I don't know who that is. The green button was never found. But in one of the case photos, Megan is wearing a jacket with a small tear near the hem, just the right size for a missing button. A week later, an anonymous tip came through, a man's voice. Calm, flat. He said, you're wasting time with Roy, look into the truck. Then he hung up. They never traced the call. Phones in that area didn't have caller ID in 1981. If you called from a payphone, you were invisible. That call marked a turning point. The sheriff's department split half the team. Wanted to keep looking into Frank and Roy. The other half suspected someone else entirely. Maybe a drifter, maybe a deal gone bad. After all, rumors had started to swirl. Rick, Linda's brother, said he'd heard from a co-worker that someone was using the woods outside Aspen Ridge to move product, mostly meth, occasionally cocaine. He said a camp up by Bitterroot Lake was being watched by federal agents, though no documentation ever surfaced. One theory went like this. Linda saw something she shouldn't have, or maybe Jason and Kyle did, or maybe Megan overheard something, and someone made sure they wouldn't talk. But again, no forced entry, no money missing, no drug stashes found, just a lot of fear, a lot of guesses. They tried to test the claw hammer for blood types. Remember, this was pre-DNA testing, and blood typing was about as precise as tossing darts blindfolded. They found 2 types, type A and type A-O. Linda was type A, Jason was type O, Kyle's records weren't even in the system yet. You go back to the footprints now. Remember the waffle tread boot print? There was one other faint track found outside, smaller, barefoot. Probably Megan's. The ground was cold, wet. If she walked willingly, why didn't she grab shoes? A coat. If she was taken by force, why no dragging marks? Unless she knew the person. Unless they asked her to come quietly. Unless they told her not to wake the others. You stand outside the back porch again. Imagine Megan's feet stepping down onto the damp wood. Imagine someone holding her hand. Imagine a quiet voice saying, "It's okay, just a short drive." You want to scream into the woods, but they've already heard it 30 years ago, and they're not answering. At this point, the case is fraying. Reporters lose interest. The town moves on. Cabin 12 is shuttered, left to rot, until one winter, a bear tears through the front wall and rips up the kitchen floor looking for food. After that, it's demolished for safety. But somewhere in the sheriff's office, inside a rusting cabinet, the clawhammer still waits, and so does the truth. You're back in Aspen Ridge, though the calendar has flipped and the leaves are red now. Frank Peterson still lives in cabin 10. Roy Caldwell still occupies the room down the hall with the curtain instead of a door. And the town still murmurs about what happened in cabin 12, though, only in low voices, and only when they think the kids are out of earshot. People don't move to Aspen Ridge. They end up there. Frank, for instance, came back from Vietnam with a discharge, a box of medals, and a fuse that burned hot and fast. He rarely talked about the war except when drunk, and even then, the stories never quite lined up. He claimed to have been special recon, but a friend once whispered that Frank's file actually listed him as a quartermaster. Historians still argue whether post-war PTSD was accurately diagnosed in the early 80s, or if rural veterans like Frank simply slipped through the cracks angry, isolated, and armed. Frank didn't just have a temper. He had control issues. Neighbors said you could set your watch to the way he barked orders at Jeremy, at Roy, at the dog who refused to heal. Linda had mentioned it once to her brother. That man watches everything, like he's waiting for a reason. And then there was Roy. Roy Caldwell was a shadow wrapped in denim, no known relatives, no clear job. No one had seen him drive. He rarely left the property unless Frank was with him. He said little, did less. He paid for his half of the rent in cash that always looked too new. And yet, for someone so quiet, he gave people that feeling, the kind you get when a mannequin blinks. Roy told folks he was a writer, said he was working on a novel about isolation and memory. But when asked what it was about, he'd just smile and say, "You'll find out." One woman claimed she saw him digging behind cabin 10 late one night. Another said he asked about nearby caves, yet no one really saw him do anything. That was the unnerving part. When the murders happened, both Frank and Roy claimed they were home all night. Frank said he was watching a John Wayne double feature on VHS. Roy said he was asleep. They both insisted they never heard a sound. But remember, Cabin 10 was just 40 yards from Cabin 12's on a still Montana night. You can hear a squirrel drop a pine cone from that distance. The problem? The authorities couldn't prove they lied. Frank's confession came later. In 1985, 3 years after Megan's remains were found, Frank visited a therapist in Missoula, part of a court-ordered anger management program, after he allegedly struck Jeremy during a domestic dispute. The therapist, whose notes surfaced much later, recorded a chilling statement. "Sometimes I dream about what we did. The girl, the hammer. I can still hear her." The therapist, following Montana's confidentiality laws at the time, did not report the confession. He wasn't required to unless he believed there was an ongoing threat. Frank never returned for his next session. And then, years passed. Roy died in 2006, a heart attack, alone, in a trailer he rented just outside Kalispell. No funeral, no will. A shoebox of cash was found under his mattress, along with a single Polaroid of a girl sitting on a log near a lake. It wasn't labeled, but Linda, when shown the photo, said quietly, "That's Megan's shirt." Frank died in 2009. Liver failure. No family visited. Jeremy, now an adult, declined to claim the body. You walk through cabin 10, now empty and sold off for parts. The wood floor is warped, the sink rusted, the back room. Roy's room is still shadowy, as if light itself refused to stay. A neighbor later recalled that once, in the summer before the murders, he saw Roy burning something behind the cabin. Papers, clothes, maybe. When asked what he was doing, Roy answered, "Cleaning house." No one thought to question it then. But looking back, You remember the anonymous tip? You're wasting time with Roy. Look into the truck. They never traced that call, but maybe it didn't need tracing. Maybe it was Frank trying to point the finger, or maybe it was someone else entirely. Jeremy, now in his 30s, has a family of his own and lives across the state. He's rarely spoken publicly about what happened, but in a 2012 letter to a local reporter, he wrote, "Everyone thinks I forgot. I didn't. I remember it all. But if I ever told you what I saw, you wouldn't sleep either." The reporter never published the full letter, said it felt more like a confession than a memory. And here's something else. Frank once had a military buddy named Ken. He visited twice in 1980, stayed a weekend, drove a green truck. No one ever found Ken. No one even knew his last name. Just Ken. That name scrawled in pencil on an old visitor log from the general store was circled by investigators years later. Next to it, a note in red ink. Possible connection. Camper. Lake. You start to see the picture forming, even if it's warped. A girl disappears. A neighbor confesses years too late. A roommate hides in plain sight. And somewhere in the background, a green truck with no plates, no paper trail, and possibly no driver still haunts the back roads of Montana. Even now, the residents of Aspen Ridge remember that spring with a mix of dread and guilt. Some say they always suspected Frank. Others say Roy was the real monster. Still others believe the killer was someone else entirely, someone who slipped in, did the unthinkable, and vanished before sunrise. But in truth, the story doesn't end in a cabin or a confession. It ends with silence. And the one question no one can answer: why was Megan taken? And why did they let the others live? You drive the road at night now, the one that snakes past Aspen Ridge like a lazy thought arrow, patched, lined with trees that lean in just a little too close. Your headlights catch every twitch of emotion, deer, shadows, maybe memory. You're looking for something that was seen once and never seen again. A green truck, boxy, faded, army surplus, or maybe just beaten to that color. The kind of vehicle that doesn't make noise so much as it absorbs it. Several witnesses said they saw it parked across from cabin 12 in the early morning hours of April 12, 1981. No plate, no identifying decals. One neighbor described it as just sitting there, like it was waiting for someone. The problem: the sighting wasn't officially recorded until 2 weeks later. You step into the sheriff's office again, this time in the fluorescent haze of bureaucracy. File cabinets, stale coffee, a corkboard with yellowing pushpins that map out the investigation like a conspiracy theory no one wants to believe in anymore. One report mentions a green truck registered in Kalispell to a Kenneth Year, but the plate was lost. The registration lapsed, and Kenneth himself had vanished off the grid by 1982. Nobody knows if it was the same truck. Nobody ever confirmed whether Kenneth was real. The general store logbook, the one with Ken signed in 1980, has gone missing, misplaced during renovation. The clerk says, sure, you find another detail buried in the reports, a boot print, separate from the others, with a different tread pattern, one not matching Frank or Roy. Larger, deeper, possibly from a steel toe boot. You wonder, was there a third man? Jeremy's story starts to make more sense when you remember this. Under hypnosis, he described two men, one with glasses, one with painty hands. But in later sessions, he mentioned another man just once, the one with the quiet boots. When asked to clarify, he simply said he walked without crunching. Whatever that means, historians still argue whether memory under trauma becomes fragmented or hyper-detailed, whether you remember less or remember too much, and your brain redacts the worst parts just to protect you. Either way, Jeremy's recollections were treated more like riddles than evidence. You shift focus to the behavior of Frank and Roy in the weeks after the murder. Frank stopped hunting, something he used to do religiously. He stopped walking the trail behind the cabins. He boarded up the back window of cabin 10, said it was drafty, but no one else noticed. Roy, meanwhile, was seen at the hardware store buying bleach and paint, white paint and bleach. The clerk remembered because Roy was always so awkward. And that day he was jittery, sweating, and he paid in cash rolled tightly, edges fraying. A retired deputy later recalled a conversation with Frank at a roadside diner. He said Frank asked about statutes of limitations in murder cases. Frank claimed it was for a book he was reading. The deputy didn't think much of it, but after Frank died, The memory felt heavier, and there's more. A local hiker came forward in 1984, claiming he'd seen a tarp-wrapped bundle near Bitterroot Lake that spring, about a month after Megan disappeared. He said it was gone the next time he hiked through, but the memory haunted him. When the sheriff's department searched the area, they found nothing. Then, in 1985, an anonymous caller dialed the local precinct. The voice was flat, male, untraceable. He said, "Check the north side of Bitterroot, by the fire pit with the 3 rocks," then hung up. 2 days later, they found Megan's remains 50 miles from Aspen Ridge, in a shallow depression in the soil, mostly bones by then. Torn fabric, bits of duct tape, 1 shoe. No clear cause of death could be determined. There was no skull fracture, no bullet wound, just trauma left behind in the softest places. The pathologist said she may have died from asphyxiation, or exposure, or fear. Linda was called to identify the items. She didn't cry. She said, "Megan never went camping without both shoes." Then she walked out of the room and collapsed in the hallway. Who made that call? That's still the question, isn't it? Frank denied ever visiting Bitterroot Lake. Roy said he didn't know where it was, but Frank's brother once owned a hunting shack nearby, abandoned since '79. No one thought to check it then. The caller was never identified. Some speculate it was Roy, finally feeling guilt. Others say it was Frank, trying to shift the spotlight. A few believe it was Jeremy, grown older, finally brave enough to speak, just not openly. But here's the haunting thought. Whoever called knew exactly where she was. You return to the site, Bitterroot. Lake is calm now. Wind presses ripples across the water like a hand smoothing out a blanket. You find the fire pit, 3 large stones arranged in a crude triangle, charcoal bits still buried in the sand. Someone's been here. Not recently, but not never. You close your eyes and imagine it. Megan, standing beside someone she trusted, maybe confused, maybe already frightened. The fire's dying. The wind's rising. She's told to sit still, to wait, to be good. Maybe she complies, maybe she runs. You'll never know. But that's where she stayed, alone, for years. 50 miles from the only place she called home. And the green truck, never seen again. Not in Montana, not anywhere. Because sometimes, vehicles disappear like people do. And the people who drive them leave no tracks except in the places where no one thinks to look. You're in town now, walking along Main Street, the version that existed in 1981. Anyway, a single diner with a jukebox that only played when it felt like it, a post office with a bulletin board cluttered with missing pet flyers and Bible study invitations, a tiny sheriff's substation that doubled as a break room and a place to dry your boots. Word of the murders in Cabin 12 had spread like wildfire through Aspen Ridge, but the thing about wildfire is, it doesn't just destroy, it reveals. All of a sudden, people remembered things they'd never said out loud. You step into the diner, retracing a day 2 weeks after the killings. Rick, Linda's brother, is at the counter, talking to a friend named Carl, an old hunter with a face like dry leather and eyes that had seen more than he ever reported. "I saw something," Carl says over coffee that's mostly steam. That night, Rick leans in. Carl continues. "Thought it was a bear at first. Big, moving quiet. But when it got closer to the tree line, I saw it was a truck, military green, headlights off, just creeping, like it didn't want to be seen." Rick asks, "Where?" "Up on Coldwater Trail, near the old logging access." Rick goes still. "That road, it's not a common one. It's steep, slick with pine needles, barely passable unless you've driven it before, or unless you've planned to use it. You drive it now. Coldwater Trail winds like a snake having second thoughts. Your tires crunch gravel. The air gets thinner. Then you see it. A pull-off near an old service gate. Rusted, unlocked. A good place to wait, a perfect place to watch. According to town rumors spread in hushes over checkouts and back fences, Frank used to park up here when he wanted peace. That's how he put it. But one neighbor, a former Vietnam buddy, once joked that Frank ran radios up this way. Everyone laughed at the time. But after the murders, the laughter stopped. You dig into the logs from that era. Spotty, handwritten, and barely legible, but one detail stands out. In early 1981, several Forest Service rangers filed informal complaints about strange tire tracks and the smell of gasoline near Bitterroot's southern perimeter. Nothing came of it. The official report was lost misfiled. Of course, another ranger, now retired, recalled hearing about a local crew using forest land to move drugs, not meth. Not yet that epidemic wouldn't hit full stride until the 90s. But cocaine. Quiet, portable, expensive enough to justify risk, and if you wanted somewhere to stash product, a lakefront camp with no one watching would be perfect. That's when the drug theory first surfaced. Maybe the murders weren't personal. Maybe they were preventative. Let's walk it through. What if Linda or Jason stumbled onto something? A drop site, a meeting. Maybe the green truck wasn't watching them. Maybe it was protecting something else. Or someone else. Frank and Roy had the means, the knowledge, the proximity. But what if they also had orders? Historians still argue whether small-town police forces in the 80s were equipped or willing to investigate local drug operations tied to ex-military or off-grid networks. The answer is usually no, especially if you're already overwhelmed by a triple homicide and a missing child. The department logged over 200 tips in the months following the murder. One of them came from a man in Idaho who claimed he'd seen a girl matching Megan's description walking beside a man with army clothes near a rest stop. No camera, no plates, no follow-up. The tip was buried under a pile of unrelated calls. Then there's the CB radio incident. One night in June 1981, Rick and a friend were scanning radio channels from his truck, mostly just to pass time. They picked up a strange transmission. Cargo safe, no squealing, drops cold, then static, then nothing. They reported it. It was written down, then dismissed as interference. But a week later, Rick found tire tracks near Bitterroot's North Dock fresh ones, and a cigarette butt, half-smoked, mashed into the dirt. Roy didn't smoke. Frank smoked unfiltered Camels. This was a Marlboro. So whose was it? These layers add up like sediment, clues that should form a mountain, but instead sink into each other and disappear. The deeper theory. Some believe Megan was taken as a warning, that someone in cabin 12 saw too much, that killing Linda, Jason, and Kyle sent a message. But taking Megan, leaving no ransom note, no demands, no contact was about leverage, fear, and yet, why leave the younger boys untouched? The running theory among locals is this: the boys were spared because they wouldn't talk. Or maybe because someone among the intruders couldn't do it. Maybe Jeremy was meant to be taken too. Maybe the plan changed. Or maybe someone saw themselves reflected in those small, blinking eyes and turned away. You sit with that thought. Imagine Roy standing in the dark, breathing hard, watching the hallway where the boys sleep. He hears one stir, a blanket rustle, and he hesitates. Or maybe it wasn't Roy at all. Maybe the one with quiet boots had the final say. Some even whispered that Megan might have been alive for weeks, held somewhere, fed, spoken to, that she may have been kept until she was no longer a problem. That's the theory. Linda could never let go. She said once to her social worker, "If she was killed that night, I'd feel it, but I think she was scared, cold, wondering why I hadn't come for her." Even now, you feel that weight. It's been decades, and the green truck still hasn't reappeared. Bitterroot Lake still shimmers under the same sky, and somewhere, in some old shack or crawl space or rusted file box, the truth still waits. Not lost, just ignored. Because in Aspen Ridge, everyone saw something, but no one saw everything. You're standing at Bitterroot Lake now, wind nudging the water just enough to make it whisper against the shore. It's early morning, dawn gray and ghostly, and the pine trees creak like old bones. This is where Megan was found. Or, rather, where what was left of her was found. 32 years after her family moved into cabin 12 for a fresh start, the forest here hasn't changed much. The rocks still sit by the fire pit. The earth is still uneven in that one particular patch, and the silence still carries weight. As if the trees remember, you circle the campsite. The fire pit is ringed with stones. 3 large ones, placed carefully, exactly like the Calder described in 1985. There's a shallow depression behind them, where the soil was once disturbed. It's grown over now. But investigators dug here. They found small bones, torn clothing, Tape remnants. Forensic technology in the mid-80s wasn't what it is today. DNA wasn't commonly used in criminal cases until after 1986. So, when they found Megan's remains, they had to rely on dental records. A pediatric dentist from Kalispell confirmed the match. Linda didn't want to see the report. She just asked for the baby tooth. Megan had been proud of losing a few weeks before the murders. Historians still argue whether the rural departments of that era were equipped to handle cases involving child abduction and homicide, especially when suspects were locals. Many departments didn't have the resources or training, and often leaned heavily on instinct and gut feel, which was about as useful as reading tea leaves in the rain. They found more than just bones at the site. There was a rusted soda can generic brand, long since out of production, and a fragment of tarp buried beneath the pine needles. A portion of rope, frayed, a button, possibly from a child's coat, and near the tree line, a single boot print partially preserved in clay-rich soil. It had the same military-style waffle pattern seen outside Cabin 12. Sound familiar? You walk to the lake's edge. The dock is splintered now, barely hanging on. But in 1981, it was functional. The sheriff's report noted that a small boat could have landed without being seen. No one thought to check if any local boats had gone missing. There were no cameras, no satellite tracking, just guesswork. And then there's the weird part. A page from a child's workbook was found tucked beneath a flat rock, about 20 yards from the fire pit. The edges were weathered, but the ink, though faded, was visible. In Megan's handwriting, it read, "I don't like it here. It smells like smoke. I miss Mom." That page wasn't reported to the public. It wasn't mentioned in the papers. Only a handful of people ever saw it. Some said it couldn't possibly be hers. Others swore her handwriting was unmistakable. Jeremy was asked about it. Years later, he stared at the copy for a long time and finally said, "Megan used to draw hearts like that." With the little tail, he pointed at the bottom of the page. A faint doodle, a heart with a curved tail, like a balloon string, same as the ones in her diary. So, what does this tell you? That she was alive after the murder, that someone kept her hidden, maybe not for long, maybe just a day, but long enough for her to write something down, long enough for her to miss her mother. You step back from the lake, from the truth that hovers just out of reach, that anonymous call. The one that led them here has been dissected for decades. Vocal tone analysis, timing, re-listen after re-listen. Some say it sounded like Frank. Others insist it was Jeremy, older, grown, trying to help without exposing himself. But there's a third theory, that it was Roy. You remember Roy, he of the blank expression and half-tucked shirts? The man no one saw walk into town, but everyone saw walking home with groceries he couldn't have paid for. The man who didn't own a car but somehow had grease under his fingernails and a permanent whiff of transmission fluid. He died quietly, in a rented trailer, surrounded by boxes of books no one had read and maps no one had marked. And tucked in his drawer, under the Polaroid of Megan, was a piece of paper with just 3 words. Fire, 3 stones. No one knows why he kept it, or when he wrote it, but it was enough to reignite interest in the case when the file was reopened in 2013. You feel the wind shift now. You remember that green truck? Gone, but not forgotten. You think about how some vehicles are registered to fake names, about how Ken signed the guest book in 1980, about how no one ever saw him again. And here's something that wasn't in the official file. A former Forest Service employee, now retired, said they once saw a green truck parked along Bitterroot's south rim weeks after the murder. No driver, just sitting. When they approached, it pulled away slowly, like it didn't mind being seen, but didn't want to talk. They gave a partial plate number. It was never followed up. Why? Because by then, the town was tired. The officials were overextended, and maybe, just maybe, someone didn't want the truck to be found. Aspen Ridge had a way of turning inward, of saying let it be, of locking up pain and taping over the cracks. And the Crawford murders, too big, too ugly, too true. You walk away from Bitterroot now, not because the mystery is solved, but because you can only look at the water for so long before it starts looking back. You're back in the sheriff's office, but it's not 1981 anymore. It's 2013. The walls are painted a fresh coat of forget-me beige. The fluorescent bulbs have been upgraded, and someone finally replaced the coffee machine, but the air still hums with old tension, like the silence after a slammed door. This is where the cold case files live now, stored in an old metal cabinet that sticks every time you open it, like it doesn't want to give up its ghosts. Enter Detective Claire Hodges. She's not from Aspen Ridge. That's the first thing people notice. The second is her notebook. It's always open, and she's always writing, even when she's not looking. Claire's in her late 30s, sharp-eyed, with a voice that could cut rope. She grew up one town over, and she used to ride the bus with Emily Crawford. That's why she asked for this case. She's partnered with a local officer named Dean Wheeler, older, skeptical, one of those guys who thinks closure is a buzzword cooked up by therapists and cable news. But he remembers the day they found Megan's body. He was a rookie then. Now, he's back in the story, 30 years later, trying to make sense of the pieces still on the board. Claire starts by rereading everything, every report, every interview, every smudged photograph in a manila envelope. She maps it out on a whiteboard. Cabin 12, the timeline, the suspects, the green truck, Bitter Root Lake. Then she writes one word in red ink across the center. Why? Why kill Linda, Jason, and Kyle? And leave the others? Why take Megan? Why tip off the police 3 years later? Historians still argue whether reopening cold cases provides justice or simply re-traumatizes survivors with no real resolution. Claire doesn't care. She believes answers matter, even old ones. She visits Rick, Linda's brother. He's older now, slower, but still sharp. He keeps a box under his bed labeled Cabin 12. Inside are photos, a matchbox from the Bitterroot Diner, a copy of Megan's drawing, and one bent button, the one Linda once found on the stove. Claire asks if he's willing to talk. He says, "I've been waiting 30 years to talk." He tells her things that never made the file. About the time Roy offered Megan a ride to the post office and Linda flatly refused. About how Frank once joked that Jason better learn to keep his mouth shut, or someone will do it for him. About the day after the murders, when Roy's boots disappeared from the front porch and were replaced with a newer pair. Claire takes notes. Then she does something no one had done before. She digs into Frank's military records. Turns out, Frank was discharged with honors, but not before a disciplinary hearing. The file's mostly redacted, but it mentions failure to follow protocol and hostility during overseas placement. One line stands out. Subject may suffer from unregulated behavioral aggression, not suitable for command environments. Then she checks Roy's background, or tries to. Roy Caldwell, according to his birth certificate, was born in Nebraska in 1949. But the social security number attached to his file was first issued in 1977. Claire flags it. That's 12 years after Roy was supposedly employed as a mechanic at a base in Texas. In other words, the timeline doesn't work. She traces the SSN further and finds it was originally registered to a man who died in a house fire in Ohio. The more she pulls, the stranger it gets. Roy Caldwell may not have been Roy Caldwell, so Claire digs harder, calls in a favor with a contact at the National Archives. Turns out, the handwriting on Roy's 1977 application doesn't match any other known documents in his file. And in the one photo attached, the man's ears don't match. Claire starts wondering, what if Roy was running from something long before Cabin 12's? What if he had a past worth hiding and Cabin 10 was just the latest hiding place? Meanwhile, Dean revisits the audio tape from the anonymous call in 1985. He plays it again and again. Something feels off, so they send it to a modern lab. It's cleaned up, digitally enhanced. Not CSI-level miraculous, but clearer. And in the background, there's something new. 3 seconds before the caller hangs up, a voice whispers something, almost too quiet, almost missed entirely. The tech slows it down, filters it. The words, "I told you we'd get caught." Claire plays it over and over and over. She writes it on her board in red ink. Then she calls Emily. Emily's in Oregon now, married, teaching art. She never wanted to talk about that night, but she agrees to speak with Claire once. They meet in a park. Emily brings a folder. Inside are sketches she made over the years. Not just Megan, not just the cabin, but the truck. In every version, it's green, boxy, 2 front seats, a cracked mirror, and in one, a child's shoe hangs from the rearview mirror, threaded by its lace. Claire asks, "Did you see it?" Emily says, "No, but I dreamed it. And I think my dreams were telling me the truth." That night, Claire drives the cold water trail alone, stops where the green truck might have waited. The wind is loud, the trees sway like they're listening. And from somewhere far off, maybe real, maybe not, she hears the crunch of tires on gravel. The case isn't solved yet, but something's waking up, and it's ready to be found. You're in a basement now, flashing fluorescent lights, concrete floor, and a cabinet marked Case, Crawford, 1981. Reopened 2013. Detective Claire Hodges has taken over the file, and the deeper she digs, the clearer it becomes. This wasn't a simple home invasion, a crime of passion, or a random act of violence. This was orchestrated, and messy, and deeply personal. Claire pins photos across the board: Frank, Roy, Linda, Megan, the boys, the sketches of the truck. She draws red yarn between them, not because it's cinematic, but because she's exhausted with digital case management systems. Yarn, unlike PDFs, doesn't freeze when her laptop battery dies. She has a new lead, a retired Forest Service ranger named Milt Bledsoe, now 78, living in Hamilton, Montana. Claire drives 4 hours to see him. He's sitting on his porch with a thermos of black coffee and a worn-out dog named Lucky. When she introduces herself, he says, "I knew someone would come eventually." You don't get that kind of greeting unless a person's been sitting with ghosts for a long time. Milt tells her something no one else did. In the spring of 1981, about 2 weeks after the murders, he came across a man sleeping in a green truck at an unmarked overlook near Bitterroot. Said he was camping between jobs. The man was polite but twitchy, asked if the ranger patrols were scheduled or random, wanted to know how often game wardens came through. "I didn't like his hands," Milt says. "They were shaking, and not from cold." Claire pulls out the old sketch of Ken, Frank's mysterious friend. Milt looks at it for 3 seconds before saying, "That's him." Now the puzzle grows stranger. Ken, who may or may not have existed, may or may not have driven that truck, and may or may not have been involved in what happened at Cabin 12, suddenly has weight, a shape, a sighting, and a possible motive. Claire checks the missing persons registry from 1980 to 1983. She finds 2 Kens with military records who disappeared in the Pacific Northwest. One was presumed drowned in a boating accident, but the body was never recovered. The other, no information beyond a blank space in a Montana DMV system, a half-finished application for a vehicle with no VIN. You ever seen a file that feels like it's hiding from you? That's what Claire's dealing with now. She starts calling in favors, old co-workers, a former military investigator with a memory like a filing cabinet. One night, she gets an email. Check Boise PD archive, 1980 case. Arrest of transient ex-military male, alias Kenneth Ray. She follows it. Kenneth Ray was arrested in Boise for trespassing on federal property. Held overnight, claimed he was meeting someone from Kalispell. Released with no charges, no forwarding address. But guess what? The arrest log listed a vehicle description, 1973 Dodge Power Wagon. Green, no plates, no registered owner. Claire prints the file and stares at it like it's a ghost's driver's license. She returns to Aspen Ridge and shares her findings with Dean. He says, "You're telling me we've got Frank, Roy, and a third man, one who vanished? Why not just blame Bigfoot while we're at it?" But Claire keeps digging. She re-examines Roy's belongings. Now archived at the county facility, one box contains notebooks rambling, paranoid pages about echoes and watched trees. But one entry, dated 2 weeks before the murder, stands out. K. Coming. Said he needs a place. F says one night only. I don't like him. He talks about quieting problems. Reminds me of the sandstorm. The sandstorm. That's military slang. Vietnam. Desert operations. Chaos. Code. Roy remembered things. He just buried them under layers of vagueness. Claire visits Emily again. This time, she brings the Boise police report. Emily reads it, quiet at first, then says, "Ken, I remember that name. Not from when it happened, from years later. Rick told me. He said Frank got real jumpy when that name came up." Emily digs through an old storage tub in her garage, pulls out a cassette tape. One of those cheap, red-labeled ones you used to record off the radio or leave answering machine messages. This, she says, was from Rick's tape recorder. He recorded Frank once, rambling drunk on the porch. Said it didn't mean anything, but maybe it does. Claire takes the tape, gets it digitized. The audio's rough, but one line punches clean through the static. Frank says, "Ken got her out. I didn't want to, but he said loose ends don't stay quiet. So we tied him. Then he took the girl, said he'd drive her far." Claire pauses the tape, stares at the waveform on screen, then presses play again. Frank's voice, lower this time. "I never saw her again." You sit with that. Think about Megan. Think about her being taken by someone she didn't recognize as dangerous, someone calm, someone quiet, maybe someone with a green truck and a hand that didn't shake until after it was done. You ask yourself, did Frank regret it? Did Roy? Or were they just afraid of Ken? Claire adds a new photo to her board. A DMV rendering of Kenneth Ray, composite sketch, eyewitness notes, still no body, still no grave, still no justice. But now, finally, someone else to look at. You stand back from the board. The cabin is gone. But the story isn't, because now, 32 years later, a name has surfaced, and the forest, which forgot so many other things, finally gave up one more whisper. You're back in the forest now, not just any patch, but the one just north of Bitterroot Lake, where the pines cluster so thickly they shut out sunlight like heavy curtains. Claire walks slowly, her boots sinking into the soft, mossy earth. A file folder tucked under one arm and a photograph in her coat pocket. It's a photo of Kenneth Ray, the man from Boise, the man from Roy's notebook, the man who, according to Frank's slurred tape confession, took Megan away. This part of the forest is different. The air feels older, thicker. Even the birds keep their distance. You follow Claire as she moves past the remnants of a long-rotted fire ring. 3 stones, familiar now and down to a shallow creek. There, tucked between 2 mossy boulders, is the entrance to a narrow ravine, hidden unless you knew to look for it. And someone did. According to new satellite maps, this area contains the faint outline of an old logging trail that was decommissioned in the late 70s, forgotten, overgrown, and almost certainly unknown to most locals in 1981, unless you had military or forestry experience, or unless you had something to hide. Claire hikes the ravine. 10 minutes in, she finds it, a rusted chain, half buried in the dirt, wrapped around a deadbolt attached to a rotted wooden hatch. She radios Dean. They dig, and beneath the hatch, they find it, an old root cellar, unmarked, not on any map. Inside, tarps, ropes, empty cans, a rusted cot frame, a child's blanket, long decayed, and scrawled on the concrete wall in faded red marker, 3 letters, MCL, Megan Crawford. Linda. You fill in the last, no bones, no body, no confirmation. But this is where she was. For hours, days, weeks. Claire photographs everything. She doesn't speak. Dean just mutters, "Jesus," under his breath. They send everything for testing. Soil samples, fabric fibers, whatever's left, and then, quietly, Claire does something that shocks no one. She has the grave at Frank's plot exhumed. Because there's one final theory that won't go away. What if Frank wasn't just a participant? What if he buried something with him? Turns out he didn't, but someone else did. In 2009, at Frank's request, Roy placed a sealed tin box in the casket. The cemetery log even recorded it. Personal effects. Authorized by next of kin. Claire tracks down the gravedigger. Retired, but sharp. He says it was heavy. I remember that. Shouldn't have been inside the box. Maps. 2 Polaroids. One of Megan at Bitterroot, same as the one found in Roy's trailer, and one of a green truck, parked beside a forest road marker, sign rusted through. The back of the photo says, in Roy's scratchy handwriting, Ken, April 12th, never again. Claire stares at that for a long time. She checks the photo location, matches it to a logging path just off Route 89 north of town. GPS confirms. It leads, eventually, to the ravine, the cellar, which means Roy knew, and Frank let him live with it. Historians still argue whether moral culpability should apply equally to accomplices in crimes of silence. If you knew, but did nothing. Are you as guilty? Claire doesn't argue. She writes, she files a final report to the state attorney's office, formally requesting the case be declared resolved, with deceased suspect, Frank primary perpetrator, Roy accomplice, Ken missing, but now not forgotten. Emily is notified. She receives the case summary in the mail, along with copies of the Polaroids. She doesn't cry, not this time. Instead, she calls Claire and says, "Tell me she wasn't alone." Claire pauses, then says she wasn't. "We just didn't find her fast enough." Linda, too, is informed. She's in a care facility now. Dementia has taken most of her language, but when Emily shows her the photo of the green truck, she stares at it for a long time, then says softly, "He never changed the tires." It's the first sentence she's spoken in weeks. You take a walk through the cleared lot where cabin 12 once stood. It's quiet. Grasses have grown over the old foundation. A single chimney base still pokes up like a tombstone. There's nothing to mark it, no plaque, no memorial. But you remember Linda's fight, Jason's courage, Megan's absence, and the 3 little boys who somehow slept through it all? Jeremy eventually writes a letter to Claire. 1 paragraph, no return address. It says, "I still hear her. I was supposed to tell, I was scared. I'm sorry." You sit with that. 2, because this wasn't just a crime. It was a failure of neighbors, of investigators, of everyone who chose to believe silence meant safety. And yet, in the end, one detective decided silence wasn't good enough. That sometimes the truth deserves to be unearthed, even when it's rotting, even when it's late, even when it hurts. You return to the clearing one last time. The wind through Aspen Ridge carries that unmistakable scent pine, soil, and a hint of something older, something soaked into the forest floor and never quite scrubbed clean. The foundation of cabin 12 is gone now. So is the chimney. After the fire that took out the tool shed in 2017, the county leveled what little remained. But if you squint, if you listen, you can still feel it. The shape of the past. A porch that creaked, a window that tapped, a mother standing in the kitchen, her coffee cooling as she watched her children tumble through the snow. You move through it like a ghost, tracing floorboards that aren't there, turning corners that no longer exist. In the corner, Jason's mattress, Megan's diary tucked under her pillow, Dylan and Seth's drawings taped to the wall, Emily's laughter echoing down the hallway. It's all still here, and it always will be. The investigation is technically closed now. Claire filed her final report 2 weeks ago. The state agreed. Frank Peterson and Roy Caldwell were responsible for the murders at Cabin 12. Kenneth Ray, alias unknown, remains a missing person of interest. The case status reads, resolved. Suspect deceased. But you know better. Resolved doesn't mean repaired. It doesn't return Linda's son. It doesn't erase the hours Megan spent in that root cellar beneath the trees. And it doesn't quite explain why. Why the boys were left untouched. Why the phone call came 3 years later. Why Megan was taken, not killed immediately. You remember that whisper on the tape? "I told you we'd get caught." It's not a boast. It's not panic. It's almost a sigh. Because guilt doesn't always scream. Sometimes it hums. Quiet, constant. Like a fridge. You stop hearing until the power cuts out and silence hits you like a slap. That's how it was for Roy. And maybe, eventually, for Frank. But not for Kenneth Ray. Because he's still missing. Still out there. Technically, no death certificate. No confirmed burial. Claire thinks he died long ago, maybe in the woods. Maybe by his own hand. But there are others who believe he simply moved again, picked a new name, found another nowhere town, another cabin, another quiet child who trusted too easily. Historians still argue whether evil looks like a monster or a man with a calm smile and clean boots. You've seen enough now to know the answer is both. Claire submitted a request to erect a small memorial at the old site. A wooden sign, simple, burned lettering that reads, "In memory of Linda, Jason, Kyle, and Megan. Aspen Ridge will not forget." The county declined, said there was no budget, so Rick carved one himself, planted it by hand, in the shadow of a sugar pine. It still stands today. Visitors occasionally leave stones at its base, or wildflowers. One year, someone tied a green ribbon to a nearby branch. No one saw who did it, but Claire has a guess. Jeremy, now a father himself, lives in Idaho under a different last name. But every April, like clockwork, a bouquet arrives at the care home where Linda lives, white lilies, and a note that says, "Still listening. Still sorry, Emily." 2. Found her way back. She published a memoir, part history, part grief map, part tribute. The last chapter is dedicated to Megan. It ends with, "If you ever wondered why I became an artist, it's because drawing is the only way to make someone come back, even if just for a minute." And what about you? You step out of the woods, onto gravel. The sky is overcast, just as it was that April morning. A crow sits on a rusted fence post, watching, not cawing, just watching. The road winds away from you, just enough curve to suggest it never really ends. And neither do stories like this. They pause. They sleep, but they don't die. Because Cabin 12 wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by silence. And tonight, at least, that silence has finally spoken. The wind through the trees softens now, and the forest seems to exhale. The shapes fade, and the weight of the story begins to lift, just slightly like mist retreating at sunrise. You step away from Cabin 12 and let it dissolve behind you, its echoes tucked gently into the folds of memory. The kind that doesn't shout or bang, but lingers. The kind that rocks in the background as you fall asleep. Neither cruel nor kind, just present. Maybe you're not ready to let go of Megan's hand yet. That's okay. Let her walk beside you for a while longer. Light on her feet. The forest, no longer a prison, but a place that remembers. The questions don't need to be answered tonight. Let them rest, like leaves curling back into the dirt. Let the green truck rust into legend, its engine gone silent, its tires long since swallowed by time. The truth doesn't always arrive as thunder. Sometimes it's just a breath in your ear, a child's drawing folded in half, a worn Polaroid left on a windowsill. And you're safe now. You made it through the night, you heard the story, and still, you're here. So lay your head down, let the shadows settle, let the names soften. There are no footsteps behind you, there are no whispers at the window, only wind, only quiet, only sleep.